My name is Christopher York, and I'm an instructor of philosophy at Langara College.
And I'm Zan Plesner. I'm a student at the University of British Columbia.
And this is Synthesis and Sophistry.
So, today on the podcast, continuing our John Russell month here at Synthesis and Sophistry, we're going to be covering his paper, Idleness Would Be Preferred Over Game Playing as an Ideal in Suits Utopia. The main ideas here are critiquing Suits Utopia, which is very influential in the philosophy of games and the philosophy of sport as well. Chris has co-edited one of his works and written extensively, so I'm sure you're going to be our shepherd through this maze.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the main target here is the kinds of activity that would be again, ideal or even acceptable in a Suitsian utopia. So first level, we have to understand what a Suitsian utopia is. Russell dedicates the first section of his paper to describing this in pretty accurate and elegant prose. What he's saying is that the utopia, as he describes it, is an exploration of what the ideal of human existence would be. Suits thought that games give us the ideal instantiation of what we would be doing if we didn't have anything better to do. And therefore he elevated gameplay as the best kind of human activity because nothing about it is required of us. It's all voluntary and it's all activity that we value autotelically or for its own sake, intrinsically, in other words. So how do we get from a world like our own, which is largely a series of instrumental requirements that we are, tirelessly pushed into engaging with point after point after point, to the extent that a lot of people feel like their freedom and integrity is, let's say, cheapened or challenged, into a world where most or all of our activities are voluntarily chosen, autotelically enjoyable instances of gameplay. To get there, Suits gives us his thought experiment of the telepathically controlled supercomputers that grant you any wish that you can think of, automatically, without effort. And he thinks that this technology, once established, takes all of the things that are, let's say, instrumentally required out of the scenario. And so by definition, whatever is left is whatever you want to do because you don't need to do anything in particular. And this utopia of material superabundance, he thinks, is by definition then a utopia of gameplay. Everything that you can think of becomes a game. Nothing is not a game. And yes, people have worried this leads to a conceptual deflation, right? Because if everything's a game, nothing's a game, and so on and so forth. Suits himself admits that utopians work at gameplay, which is kind of paradoxical, to say the least. Utopians seem to also instrumentally need games because if they don't have them, they'll be bored literally to death. So this also, this is one of Bradford's criticisms of Suits' Utopia is that even games, they're basically just there to stop utopians from killing themselves. So are they really voluntarily interacted with if they're a psychological crutch to that extent? And so that raises some questions, which Marcus is going to ask.
I was just going to say, in keeping with the whole paradox of utopia line, I've always wondered if, or at least as long as I've known about Suits and his utopia, specifically in a world where physical and psychological needs are met, I've always found it a bit incongruous that the one psychological need that apparently isn't met is the need for meaning. almost in a Viktor Frankl sense. It seems like if this striving for human meaning is so innate in us, how is that the one thing that's left out of Suits Utopia?
Yeah, I guess for Suits Utopia, the thing is all of our material needs are looked after, where I guess meaning is more of a spiritual need, like one that you can't fulfill with just material abundance. And I think you see a long line of traditions that kind of grapple with that. So I think that's really the only thing left over once all your material and needs are met.
I mean, can you really say that your life is made meaningful by scarcity? Right? Is your life more meaningful because you have to work a shitty job to get your bare minimum of groceries and fuel and whatever else you need to keep going?
No, not necessarily. I think I'm just considering it in the context of, because Suits says, according to on page 400 of this journal, that our intimate human relationships, things that also seem to fill in that space of, intrinsic sort of goods that we strive after, things that are non-material, those also seem to fall by the wayside. So it feels the search for meaning as the one thing that's left unfulfilled seems to me sort of a strange place to draw the line in terms of what the utopia contains and doesn't contain. It contains love that's meaningless, it contains art that's meaningless, but the meaning is the one thing that supercomputer, that telepathic supercomputer, doesn't provide for us. It's interesting, and it's obviously necessary to set up what Suits wants to say about human nature and utopia. It's just interesting in and itself that there has to be that limitation for the thought experiment or intuition pump to pump,
Well, I think his idea is that in striving play and in getting to the flow state, right, you're going to have a meaningful experience. And I think that in terms of our own pre-utopian lives being meaningfully structured around addressing the, let's say, exigencies of material need, in the utopia, we are instead called to engage with an artificial scarcity and structure meaningful behavior around that. So, for example, in his Return of the Grasshopper, the sequel to his original The Grasshopper Games, Life in Utopia, he says, for instance, that there's no shortage of aces in the world, right? You can go out and buy as many aces as you want, but in a game of poker, there's only 4. They're pretty scarce. And that scarcity that we kind of accept as a limitation on our gameplay introduces tension and fun and interest into that game in a way that it wouldn't if the whole deck were aces, right? So in order to structure meaningful play, you need to have this sort of illusory or in-game scarcity sort of baked in.
Yeah. And with bad games, you get things too easily, or there's not enough of that. So I guess what Russell is trying to address here is this idea that gameplay is the only meaningful activity that we can do in utopia. And he's saying that no, actually, the utopians would prefer idleness. And he gives a definition kind of further into the article, but I think it's important to talk about his definition of idleness. He gives a couple different definitions, but the one that he kind of favors is the other Russell's definition.
This on 405?
Yeah, bottom of 404, 405. Bertrand Russell associates idleness with leisure involving modest exercise of both passive and active energies, like going to movies or sports matches, or dancing or painting, or being involved in contemplation and easy types of social interaction and conversation. he also talks about O'Connor. O'Connor is not immune to making such life-affirming claims about idleness, endorsing companionship and love as idle activities, which of course Diogenes also endorses. Recent manifestos on idleness take up Bertrand Russell's more life-affirming approach, as I do. So kind of a broad range of activities that you don't have to put a lot of effort into but are intrinsically valuable is kind of what I got from this section.
Yeah, further down in 405, he says that idleness is characterized by simple and easy pleasures. It's non-productive. In other words, you're not striving to create some specific instrumentally beneficial world state, right? You're not necessarily playing in the lumberjack games to produce more sawed boards, for instance. Relaxation is key. No special training is required. And here, right, it seems pretty clearly that following from last week's paper where, Russell had tried to valorize striving, here he's trying to valorize idleness, which looks like it's a bit of an opposite in terms of the amount of effort that's required. It seemed like striving was pushing past a certain level of effort to be qualified as striving. Here, idleness seems to be characterized by the absence of effort, the presence of relaxation. So that's, let's say, for instance, he thinks it's a more desirable activity for utopians than striving play. So this is the next step of Russell's sort of conversation with himself that he's been having about this topic.
He also makes the point about striving versus strenuously striving, or strenuously effortful striving,
right,
as he says halfway through 407.
Right.
Yeah. No, and then at the bottom, it's not as if striving does not exist in idle pursuits. So one can strive to complete a crossword or to make a flower arrangement as aesthetically as pleasing as possible without necessitating strenuous effort. So now we're looking at striving of maybe a very different kind. There's some sort of striving that is so sublime that it's not strenuous, but certainly, and allows for idleness, but not in a way that produces boredom. It's a fine line.
Yeah, I mean, I think that he brings up a number of different interstices between these two concepts. So, one of the things that makes Russell's work relatable is that he often brings in stories about his personal life. On page 408, he's talking about another adventure with his son, where they're hiking in the darkness until sunrise arrives and illuminates their path back home. And here he's describing the idleness and serenity that they experience looking at the sunrise. The quality of that aesthetic experience is only possible after having striven so hard to walk through the darkness. So in this way, like, it's not a mixed striving. It's like you have to strive as a prerequisite for a certain kind of idleness that will follow.
Yeah, I found there to be a little bit of tension in that too, in that if idleness is this human ideal, but to reach this idleness, you need to strive first to really make it meaningful.
You got to deserve it.
Yeah, I guess, though, like, maybe I'm a bit more sympathetic in that, like, if you don't have those distinctions, then everything is kind of striving, right? You need those times where you're either everything is striving or everything is idleness, where if you have that differentiation between these times of striving and times of idleness, I guess it makes its meaning from that relationship.
I'll quote Frank Zappa: "You've got to get out of it before you get into it, and you've got to get into it before you get out of it."
Yeah, exactly. This does bring up a worry, though, for me for this.
What's your worry, Zan? Hit us with the worry.
This worry that he has about Suits. Does Suits' argument rest on people always pursuing gameplay? Is there not time for idleness that's just implied by how any being operates?
Yeah. I think that, the way that Suits would deal with Russell's charge here would simply be to say that, everything in Utopia is a game by definition. So because they don't have to do anything, utopians don't work in the sense that we do, and therefore everything they do is the conceptual opposite, which is play. And I think that within that, there is obviously lots of striving play, and there will obviously be lots of, interstices of time where they're waiting for an opponent to make a move, or they're training, or they're resting between matches, right? So all of that is, I think, part of, like, I think that Russell's criticism, it treats Suits's definition of utopian activity with a bit too much of a broad brush, or maybe he thinks that the activities that are implied by gameplay are more narrow than they actually are. Suits has a very broad definition of what games can be, including things we don't normally think of as games, such as mountain climbing, or trying to walk home before the sun sets, or trying to arrive at work before 9:00 a.m. on the dot, but as close as possible without being late. So, he thinks that we can let's say, looterize, make a game out of ordinary activities by, taking on the losery attitude, by having a playful attitude towards things that in another frame of mind would be onerous or boring. Again, see Sisyphus, right? But does anything that Russell says here countervene Suits really? I mean, I would think not. So I went out of my way after reading this article to make a little quadrant, right? So
nice quadrant.
Thank you. Well, I'll describe it to you for our audience as well. So it's not fair that you see it and they don't. So I'm going to try to describe it in such a way that you can reconstruct it in your mind. So think about just a square that's divided into 4 boxes. And, on the left-hand side, the top row of boxes are indicated by the title Special Training being required for the activity. The bottom boxes being indicated as having no training required. And the vertical slice of the left and right row of boxes, on the left it says effortful or active, and on the right it says easy or passive. So let's go through the quadrant and we can talk about the kinds of activities that are possible in Suits Utopia. I don't think any of these would countervene his definition of gameplay. So something that's active and requires special training might be rock or mountain climbing, right? Something that's active and requires no training might be like jogging. That seems to be fine as well. Like I said, Suits says even walking home before the sun sets counts as a game, so I don't see why that wouldn't be included. Something that's requires special training but is largely passive would be meditation. You can definitely gamify meditation. I don't see why that would be an issue. And something that's passive and requires no training is perhaps the most problematic of the quadrants. And this, I think, would be something like watching the sunset. Simply watching the sunset. And I do think that the passive activities that require no special training do suffer on Suits' account of utopian activities, because you're not gamifying anything. You're just receiving visual data and feeling a certain way. Now, could you make a game out of watching various sunsets and saying, rating them? Like, that's a 7 out of 10 on the, the criteria that I've laid out. And then every night the supercomputer gives you a slightly different sunset so you can, have a different grade. That's maybe gamifying a largely passive activity that requires no training. But then again, if you're rigorously aesthetically evaluating sunsets, is it really passive anymore?
Yeah, and I guess too, like, even if that is not a game, is that a problem for his theory? Because sleep would also probably fall into that category, and sometimes even maybe for utopians, unless they are so different from us, you need that time of complete idleness where you're doing nothing so that you have the energy for taking on those games.
Right, and so then, it goes into our interpretation of what Suits' supercomputers can actually do. Can you order the supercomputer to give you a physiology such that sleep is no longer required, right? And if so, then is your life really consisting of nothing but gameplay, right?
I guess like and one thing that I do appreciate about the article, it's like I find when Suits' Utopia is laying too much emphasis on, and you bring this up and you're quoted in here, the psychological
quoted
difference.
and dinged. Let's be fair.
Okay, yeah. If the psychological differences between the utopians and regular people is too great, then I think the thought experiment kind of, at least for me, loses its steam. So I guess there I would want to try to keep their psychology basically in line with ours.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why Russell fails to take my criticism of Suits seriously, because he does want to keep the theory useful. I don't care about usefulness. I care about the truth. And I think that the truth is that human experience, separated and segregated from activities that, address, human needs, I don't think we're really in a historical or a psychological position or condition to accurately describe what that would be like. It's kind of like imagining you're God. Yeah, go ahead, give it a shot. But yeah,
wouldn't that be a different being we're describing then? And then
that's what I think.
The thought experiment fails to map on to.
That's my contention.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, because I mean the parameters of Suits' experiment are such that his supercomputers can give you anything you want, and anything you want is anything you want, and anything you want is not simply constrained to external needs, right? People do, want to look different than they do. They want to have different capacities than they do. If you know any young adolescents, they will tell you about the different ways that they feel that they would change themselves if they could to better match the world around them or to live a better life that they're imagining. The question is, once you indulge enough of these whims and wants and wishes, do you still recognize yourself on the other end of that process? And I think that without any sort of brakes built onto this machinery, this conceptual machinery that Suits has provided us with, any errant thought or wish that you have about yourself results in a change in world states, and then that next form that you take on has its own wishes and wants that you really can't predict. It's kind of like looking at your life in reverse. Like, let's say you're 80 and you're looking back at this stage in life and you say, I don't understand that Zan. What was he on about? What did he want? Why did he spend his time doing X instead of Y or Y instead of Z? Right? It's that problem, but magnified by an exponential factor, because you're developing and changing with every want and wish. It doesn't happen over a long period of time. It happens after 1 minute of 1 second, an instant of wanting something other than what you are to become.
So do you think that is what sort of prompts Russell to try to look beyond games into leisure, into an almost stoic account of existing and experiencing your aesthetic pleasures as you'll experience them as a new utopian ideal, because such a, again, strenuous or such a demanding Suitsian version of utopia just doesn't jive with our human intuitions?
Yeah, probably. He's trying to humanize utopia.
I guess so. And I don't want to take us too much off track here, but I guess we are in the arena of Suits here. I just, if the utopians are so different to us, then I guess, couldn't you just posit the spaghetti monster utopia and talk about that being that's like, if it doesn't relate to humanity or, how we live in the world, maybe I'm just not understanding what the value in Suits' Utopia is then.
Yeah. Well, let's do a thought experiment within a thought experiment. So let's say that Suits' utopian supercomputers exist, and you can have anything you want and be anybody you want to be and change the world in any way you want it changed. What's your first thing? What's the first thing you wish for?
About myself,
Or about anything.
End world hunger. There we go.
Sure. No more world hunger. Now what? So now you're already in with that first moment. Okay, we're there. No more world hunger. Already there are unimaginable social, political, existential realities that you're forced to confront that you never had to confront historically in the entire history of humankind. That's the first thing.
Yeah.
Now what? Now what do you want? The computer's still running. Now what are you thinking? World hunger is solved.
Yeah.
And we thank you for it. Now what?
Okay.
So you see, like, if we slow it down a little bit and sort of walk through the steps of what Suits is asking us to do, you can tell that, like, in 5 minutes, you're going to be something completely unrecognizable because you're taking on this radically alien perspective almost immediately, and then you're just amping it up from there to the point where when Suits describes utopian games as magnificent games that are unthought of and unimaginable today, yeah, I think they are literally unimaginable.
So is talking about the utopians then, like, yeah, I guess trying to talk about God, like,
Yeah.
I guess maybe a reductionist might just say we shouldn't talk about this because we know so little, it's nonsense.
Right. So either we go full nonsense and we explore the logical spaghetti code that Suits has left for us, or we tighten the thought experiment to the point where it eliminates these holes that he's left open, intentionally or unintentionally.
Okay. So yeah, maybe then I was missing that piece of Suits' argument.
Well, this is my interpretation of Suits.
I see.
But these are all holes that he leaves open and never closes.
Yeah, because he wants to describe humans, basically human psychology, and you're saying that that's not possible because of these factors that. Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that, like, any dissatisfied human, and that's like all humans, their first wishes are going to be to address the sources of their dissatisfaction. But the sources of human dissatisfaction, as former existentialist students, you know this, they're endless, right? We have all sorts of anxieties and dreads and feelings of insecurity and we're adrift in many ways that we would rather not be. And so I can't help but think that if we had all this machinery hooked up to each of us, we'd remake the world in radically different ways.
Yeah, it almost seems
simultaneously.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
But yeah, it almost seems to me like Suits leaves games as a way to keep his utopians human. And even as Russell discusses, a lot of the motivation behind games is going to be to reintroduce emotions related to competition and frustration and the way that games are played and the way that games frustrate us, but also ultimately lead us to some sort of, cathartic benefit. Right. It's almost like that's the back door he leaves open so that even if the utopians are gods, they're all gods on the same playing field, so they still retain a base humanity through that competition.
Right. The rules of the game circumscribe the limits of their behavior. Yes. The fact that everybody's a god doesn't threaten or upset me as long as they're all playing chess all the time. Yes. I could care less whether they're gods or humans at that point. Yes. But the question I think that Russell's raising is, does everybody want to play chess forever? No, he thinks.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. It's a good question. I don't think I would want to play chess forever.
Yeah, and I kind of had this come up as well in reading the article, like this idea that the utopians for Suits would only have sort of one thing that they would want to do when there's infinite possibilities, like playing games. It does seem kind of just like maybe culturally situated or an individualist, an outlook that comes from an individual who maybe values that thing when there's endless possibilities. So I think I had a similar sense to you guys there.
And he also does bring up that point, right? He talks about our Western competitive mindset being perhaps a bit of baggage that Suits is bringing into the idea of utopia means that we're all competing or gamifying our lives to such an extent that we're always striving, as opposed to maybe a bit more of a chill version of that.
But he also says that, in terms of cooperative games, there's still there's potential there for poor sportsmanship and bad feelings. As anybody who's ever played Pandemic will know, right? Have you played Pandemic? I played Pandemic a few times, but I played it with a know-it-all who had played the game many times and who knew the optimal strategy for achieving the communal goal, and basically just micromanaged every other player's behavior to easily overcome the difficulties that the game engine was supposed to produce, right? And so there's cooperative games that sort of transcend our traditional, fascination with dominance and overcoming and, comparative betterness aren't necessarily the way forward, as Russell enjoins us to consider.
Yeah. And he talks about this on 402, I believe. These upsetting emotions, how it defeats utopia after a while because of, exactly. People like this. I know that one of your projects has been utopian games, or talking about what utopian games would be like. Is that on the menu, like games that would try to bypass I guess, do you buy Russell's argument here that it destroys the whole system once it's introduced?
One of the caveats that isn't mentioned by Russell, but is mentioned by Suits specifically, is that all his utopians go through a process of, and I don't know what the hell this means, psychological perfection. So any psychological illnesses, which is problematic because if you remember back in history, there was a time when homosexuality, for example, was on the DSM, right? So that tells you that what we consider to be a psychological illness today might not be what they'll consider a psychological illness in the future, and going back to the past, right? So this is an issue. What does psychological perfection mean? How does it apply to utopian behavior? So from my point of view, it means that somebody who's psychologically perfected is someone who can be trusted with the use of the God computer, right? Because you don't want someone who's sociopathic to have a machine that can basically re-terraform the world and change human bodies, right? So what does that mean? I assume that it means something like having a Kantian regard for others as ends in themselves. But is Suits' Utopia merely the kingdom of ends reskinned? I don't think he meant that. But so there's lots of sort of questions that come up with this. And again, it raises a lot of questions. What does a psychologically perfected human look like? And I'm not sure that any theory of psychology has an answer other than a statistical norm. But statistical norms, they change over time in historical conditions, and they really aren't necessarily an ultimate guide as to what's wrong or what's right. If the air pollution reaches a certain, let's say, level of toxicity that 70% of humans have lung cancer, that's the norm. Does that mean that because of stats, it's no longer an illness because most people have it? It seems the same problem arises with psychological imperfections.
Well, Russell brings up this psychological question too through Hello Chuck, and at the top of 402 talks about the idea of a thrill from playing games being and a form of contentiousness being a psychological defect, and that the utopians, he's sort of recharacterizing Suits utopians as people who wouldn't enjoy conflict or competition.
And thus he takes Holochek's criticism more seriously, because they said, look, if you have, on its own grounds, Suits' Utopia is theoretically inconsistent, because the purpose of utopian games is to give them the thrill they need to overcome the existential threat of boredom and survive post-scarcity. But they're exactly the kind of people that won't take any thrill out of humiliating opponents or glorying in their own victories. So what's the point? What does gameplay do here? And again, I would say that we have to go back to Suits' definition of gameplay as happening by definition utopia. It's not necessarily about the enjoyment of it anymore.
It's about finding meaning through purposely pursuing something for its own autotelic end.
Right.
I wonder, it feels to me like idleness fits within the concept, at least Russellian idleness fits it within the concept of a game then, a game of self-mastery. It's trying to be good at being idle. I mean, even his hike up the mountain with his son, at 3 a.m. to see the beautiful sunrise. To me, that feels like a form of game that they're playing against themselves to try to best experience the sunset. I'm not sure if you guys had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I guess just that I think he's pointing to some tension in Suits' theory here, but I think that's because Suits is, at least in my opinion, his definition of a game is too broad. Russell's striving, which I like how he discusses, idleness. I like how he discusses idleness a lot, and I do think that people in the state of utopia would value that and probably have that within their routine, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, assuming that that's the hard part, right? Because I think Suits is trying to keep his utopians human enough to map on at least partially to us as humans so that we can draw something out of it. And yet, if you live in a world, like, to me, if I'm playing a game in utopia and I want to win, now, of course, maybe this is a different kind of gamesmanship since this is achievement play rather than striving play, but the number one question I'm going to ask the supercomputer, what's the next move that the opponent's going to play? Or maybe if we're playing chess, what's the ideal move to play in this position? So some of the joy gets taken out of it, or some of the meaning seems to get taken out of it just by the milieu it takes place in. So I understand the impetus to try to bring idleness into it as a balancing force so that you can be happy in yourself on your own without needing to play games. Because these games in utopia seem to have sort of an artificiality that doesn't feel very satisfying to me personally from my non-utopian perspective.
I mean, I guess that to bring it back to us today, we see evidence of poor sportspersonship in professional and amateur sports. Often, we think it's bad form. We could expect that if there's anything left of utopian morality, it would be instanced through good sportspersonship, at least. But, right, there has to be, like, as Russell points out, I think more than once in the article, this is quite an attenuated form of morality. It's quite a thin slice of human experience unless we stuff everything into the category of gameplay that we would normally call non-gameplay, which seems counterintuitive. To further sort of nuance the distinction, Russell brings out quite a humorous passage on 410. Bottom of the first full paragraph. He says between the utopian strivers who are involved in this kind of effortful gameplay and the idlers that embrace his kind of preferred activities, he said, there is no need for idlers to prevent them from following their bliss. They can simply ask the computers to create special asylums or isolated islands where Suitsian gamers can live their non-utopian lives in isolation from and without tainting the idler's utopia. We mentioned this a bit last week, right? When we said that, if you're enjoying meditation and someone's like jiggling, really into some sort of computer game and they're like getting excited and they're getting worked up, that might take away from your bliss. So here we're talking about a utopia with an asylum built into it, where we put compulsive strivers. Here he talks about the ant hopper, and he says, actually, if we look at the original fable by Aesop, the ant and the grasshopper isn't obsessed with gameplay to the point where that's all that he does. That's a compulsive kind of behavior. That's the opposite of being psychologically perfected, being obsessed with something. He says, actually, the grasshopper of fable is someone who just does a lot of nothing or pursues pleasures, right? So here he says, on the bottom of page 410, Suits' grasshopper seems obsessed with game playing in a way that does not come through in the original fable of the grasshopper, whose days seem to be filled with less demanding or structured idle play and leisure, lazing in the sun, hopping or gambling around, enjoying others' company, consuming good meals, and maybe having a drink or two, and undoubtedly playing some games. In short, Suits might have better focused on utopia as a play or leisure ground, as a celebration of the human self and personality and engagement of human agency as an antidote to utopian boredom. Rather, he seems to start and end his discourses with his career-long preoccupation over playing games. So, here, this is a not quite an ad hominem against Suits, but definitely Russell's trying to point out that he's cherry-picked the elements of Aesop's fable that he wants to use to produce a vision of utopia that reflects his own values over a more humanistic, realistic depiction of what people who, divorced from all the concerns that force them into work and toil, would actually engage in.
Yeah, Rawls' objection over utopia, that it reflects whoever's talking about their personal utopia. It's
Nozick. Yeah.
What did I say? Rawls. Oh, I did. Yeah. Might be they're mixed up in my head all. But yeah, no, absolutely. It also has a nice little benefit, at least for Russell, in that it feels very Aristotelian, this idea of leisure as our ultimate end or our ultimate self, what we do when we have the time to do it rather than when we need to work. And I mean, even within the Aristotelian framework, he being Aristotle, acknowledges that some people are luckier than others. Some people get to have more leisure just by nature of their birth and their situation. So it does feel like, okay, if we're looking at an Aristotelian virtue-based framework, then giving ourselves all the space in the world to leisure in our own way and to appreciate that does feel like an ultimate end that fits nicely within Russell's framework. Although the nested utopias, the utopias that your type A personalities and your type B personalities get sorted into different utopias, your competitors, your cooperators, everyone getting sorted into different utopias.
It's Hogwarts all over again.
Exactly, until everyone is in a house that is just themselves on their own, leisuring and enjoying the aesthetic pleasures of life with no striving against anyone else. It's so disconnected from the human experience now. It is hard to say where we would go psychologically with that.
Yeah, I'm starting to get the elegance of your objection to Suits here, Chris. The more we go through it, like psychologically perfected, what does that mean? Morally perfected, what does that mean? It boggles the mind.
And to be fair to Suits, he never intended for any of these threads to be pulled at too vigorously. All he wants is a quick and dirty philosopher's thought experiment to get him to his conclusion. right? He's like, how do I show that all life's problems have been solved? You're healthy, you're psychologically perfected, you're morally perfected, moving on. Is about how much time he gives it in the book. He doesn't get into the nuts and bolts. He does not get lost in the weeds. He just says, whatever you call that, it's done. Don't worry about it. So like you might think, for example, if I give you $1 billion and you still have, tooth decay and neuroses, you still have problems. You still have things to do. He wants to eliminate all that. You have nothing to do, right? Nothing. So he is categorically just ruling out different kinds of concerns that we would normally, say that would normally monopolize our attention, and he just eliminates them like a mathematical equation. Yeah. The problem is with this kind of quick and dirty philosophizing, it does raise more questions than it answers, and I kind of wish that he'd flown a little closer to the ground so we could see what he was up to.
Yeah.
What is and the sequel does a bit to explore that ground. So like in the original, the Grasshopper Games, Life in Utopia, there's about 1.5 chapters on Utopia and the rest is on gameplay and the philosophy of sports and games. In the sequel, it's inverted. There's about 1 chapter and a bit on the definition of gameplay and the rest is exploring the philosophy of Utopia.
Yeah. And to be fair, I mean, Utopia is always fertile ground for criticism. You can always poke holes in any utopia that's proposed quite easily. But I don't think the pursuit of trying to think about utopia or pose one is completely meaningless or not valuable. I do think that there's aspects to Suits' work that resonate, but maybe just doesn't have that vigor.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the issue with Utopia is it's always going to divide people into camps. They're going to say, well, that's your Utopia, man. Right? And your vision of the perfect world is going to be very different than my vision of the perfect world, presumably. But I do think that it's an interesting conversation to engage in. And I do think it's an invitation to, sort of look at our normative, bases and reevaluate them under a sort of different frame. So I do think it is a productive discussion to have. It's not the kind of question like, what's your favorite color? Purple is better than green. Fight me, right? It's not like that. It's
you're one of those purple people, are you?
It's a little more nuanced than that, right? You can give reasons. You can draw alternate depictions of the perfect world. You can refine those utopias until they actually become something more like our form of life, more relatable, more concrete.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the same way that Plato used it as a target to aim at, I think Suits is doing something similar. And I think games are essentially our life projects, whatever they may be. And right now, there's no denying that we're in a competitive framework. We're in a competitive world. There's not enough food for... I mean, maybe there is enough food, but it's not getting to the right places to feed everyone. There's not enough jobs to go around. There's not enough this. There's not
all
enough
part
that.
of the great game, Marcus.
All part of the... Well, actually...
Keeping life meaningful for us all.
Well, I think that's kind of the point. I think when you're looking at Utopia as being filled with games, I think everything in life reduces down to being a game. It's just a matter of who you're playing against. Right now, we're playing against a universe of scarcity. Eventually, we'll be playing against other people in a non-universe of scarcity, and maybe if Russell's correct, then once we move beyond that, once everyone's been segregated into their own personal utopia, we're in an era of quiet contemplation and reflection. I don't know, maybe that's where the Buddha is now. In fact, I wanted to ask you guys, what do you think? Do you think that do you think that meditation is a game or is an idleness activity? Because I think that's an important distinction to make.
Under Suits' definition, I guess, what's the obstacle there? You are trying to overcome your thoughts taking hold of you. So yeah, like that's probably my main criticism with Suits. His definition is too broad, so I think you could really put just about anything and call it a game under his definition.
Yeah, you could see meditation existing under either form. You could see like I meditated for 4 hours today.
Yeah.
Didn't move a muscle.
Well,
What's your record?
Yeah.
That could be like, meditation bros.
Yeah, 1,000 years subsisting off a dewdrop and the energy of the universe. But I think that, to me, as I was reading this, the further and further I got into it, the less and less I saw the distinction between Russellian idleness, and we're not talking about like a car just idling in the driveway, like true idleness without any form of meaning to it. In fact, that car idling is probably the perfect example of Russell's entropy, where it's just energy burning through for sustenance. But when you've got an idleness that consists of, and bear with me as I find a quote, but as you go from an idleness of an absence of goal-directed activity into one that has a wider range of simple, like you said, York, simple and easy pleasures, in a heterogeneous range of activities, non-productive in worldly terms, amusements, entertainments, aesthetic experience, bodily comforts and pleasure. But if you're pursuing those in the pursuit of meaning, it seems to come very, very close, for me at least, to being a game. It's almost arbitrary, except in its pursuit of meaning and the goodness inherent in that. And it's done simply to provide meaning in this utopia. So to me, it melds together. It's idleness as a game, or as play.
I mean, I guess I kind of want to tie this back into what you were saying earlier about life projects.
Yeah, okay.
So Suits is not ignorant of the existential tradition. In fact, he steals wholesale from Schopenhauer, from Dostoevsky, and a couple of others. And I'll talk about that in a paper I've got coming out soon. But him being cognizant of this sort of stereotypical existential life project as being nothing more than a self-selected game, right? You choose the goal, you choose the means by which you're willing to pursue that goal, and you structure your entire life around it. One of his first articles, right, is life a game we are playing? Right? He's already kind of tending in that direction. Is meditation the focus of your life's game? Is it a sub game that you play just for maintenance as you pursue these sort of greater life projects and sort of like, so there's, if life is a game, it's one of the more complex ones.
Certainly. Magnificent even.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's the thing, right? So Suits says that, we'll exert as much effort in these magnificent utopian games as we would in working and living in today's world. So they're at least that nuanced, right? Which means that there can be games within games and sub-games and periods of training which feed back into the main game, right? Yeah, I'm reminded of Ian M. Banks' The Player of Games, right? There's a game in there called Azad, right, which is hyper complex. So the board for the game of Azad in Ian M. Banks' A Player of Games is like bigger than sort of 4 high school gymnasiums, patched together. That's just the board. And you can walk through the game board and you can engage with pieces of varying sizes and scales. And there's hundreds of thousands of kinds of pieces, each with its own powers. Think about chess. You only have, 8 pieces? 1, 2, 3, less than. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pieces. There's 6 powers. And maybe some pieces have more than 1 power, so maybe there's 8 powers. That's what I had in mind. Right? So you have castling, and you have the double move of the pawn. And there's a couple of other very slight ones, but those are the big ones. So there's about 8 different kinds of moves you have to memorize. The people for many hundreds of years, possibly thousands, thought that was complicated enough. Now imagine a game where you have hundreds of thousands of pieces, some of which have multiple moves. And then on top of that, there's a card element to it. And there's a secondary room that you go to sort of play a political game to affect what happens on the board. there are pieces that the powers change when your DNA comes in contact with it. So depending on what the DNA that you have with you when you play the game, the pieces' powers will change. There are cards that the text changes based on, let's say, time of day or temperature of the card. It's hyper complex. You have to be attentionally completely zoned into this game to have any hope of even understanding a fraction of what's going on, let alone become a master of this game. I think this is kind of what Suits has in mind. A game that you can profitably throw all of your energy into and never come close to comprehending fully. And that requires there to be lots of dimensions that are skillful, and also other dimensions that are aleatory or random to provide enough variation to keep you from just memorizing the correct play or resorting to heuristics or algorithms.
Yeah, it's almost like they're like, for instance, in chess, it can be the case that you might both players might know the perfect moves or the perfect game state 20 moves out, and yet the way to win in that case is to do a substandard move, something that'll throw your opponent off board, and it almost is like the responsive openness that Russell talks about, Drew Hyland's idea that the playful stance is one of responsive openness to one's surroundings, taking account of their features and reacting appropriately. So a much more in the moment mindful form of existence than thinking 9 or 10 steps ahead and trying to outplay the game or outplay the world in that way.
I thought that's what Zan was doing with me the other night when we were playing chess. It turns out
No.
he was making suboptimal moves for a completely different reason.
You don't see my long game, Chris. I'll let you win 3 and then never again.
It's the hustle, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Now let's make this interesting. Let's put $20 on it.
I'm playing 4D chess.
Yeah.
All right. Do we have anything else we want to say about Russell here?
Anything you wanted to catch up on, Zan or Marcus, that you didn't get a chance to speak on?
I think we've pretty much covered the main points I wanted to talk about. I do think that Russell, he puts a lot of holes in Suits here, but I do think he's just kind of maybe sidestepping the deeper problems here or not addressing them head on, which I don't think is necessarily bad. I think he also gets to talk about idleness, which I'm always very happy to read about and discuss, because I think it's something that's overlooked generally as a valuable thing in itself. So I enjoyed the article. I would give this one probably a B+ as well. Also, too, the anecdote about his son, I'm a sucker for those. He really, you can tell those mean a lot to him, and it's sweet. It's really nice.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I thought about talking just before we finish is like the concept of the good that you have to subscribe to for these utopias to be utopian. The idea that meaningfulness is an inherent good that we pursue. It sort of illuminated for me in a different way the striving conversation that we've been having for the past few weeks, because in these utopias, in the same way that in sport, striving is sort of it's a good. Russell says this on page 407. He talks about that striving is a cardinal virtue in sport and games and in human life generally. But I think that this article did a good job for me at sort of breaking that down in terms of in sports, in games, the striving towards, the purpose of the game. There's a presupposed goodness in that versus striving for some other reason outside of living in utopia and trying to find self-fulfillment. So I think it just further, maybe unfortunately for Russell or maybe not, it further made me question whether or not striving is one of those ultimate goods. Especially in a world where maybe idleness is even better. But I thought this was a pretty solid argument or article either way, an A- for me.
Yeah, I think maybe we all have acquaintances or friends that have or do still try too hard, and that's a vice, not a virtue, right? It's let's say not embracing the right kind of idleness that would make them a better friend, right? If they're always trying to sneak the word homunculus into a discussion, and it just becomes irksome after a while. Like, you're not really having a genuine experience with them because you're just waiting for the word homunculus to appear again, right? And you're waiting for that clumsy word to drop in your conversation and to disrupt everything. And they're having the time of their lives.
But they're not really acting within good faith within the conversation.
Right. Maybe the closest thing I can say, you're playing two different kinds of games, or maybe one of you is playing and one of you is not. One of you is a piece in the other's game, which, again, to go back to that Kantian point, like if we're using other people as amusements or as pieces in our game, there's something immoral about that. But that's the position that we're forced into in Suits Utopia. We are required to use other utopians as sources of our amusement. Otherwise, all of our lives are forfeit, right? Because then boredom will ensue. I think that what Russell's trying to do, and you can argue that he's relatively successful, is to give us a third way of not treating each other as pieces in our games that give life meaning, but to say that you can, hey, just take it down a notch. Just touch grass, watch the sunset, maybe do some painting. I don't know.
I think he refocuses it on the self nicely. Leisure, playing, sort of making your life a game against yourself to just experience it that much better every time.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that, it says a lot about retirement. Russell recently retired very, let's say, historically recently, before this article was written. And I think, and this is my own kind of interpretation, he interpreted Suits as being, overly concerned with games and sort of sneaky into his work. I'm going to say that maybe, biographically, this is Russell's series of papers for beginning to deal with the issues surrounding retirement, right? Do you write academic papers, incessantly, or at a certain point, are you just okay to, walk in the woods with your sons, right? And I don't know, even at this point in my career, I struggle with the same question. What is the point of constantly publishing works, just because someone writes a paper about you, are you therefore obligated to get into this, kind of kayfabe feud with them to enrich both of your careers? Is that really meaningful? Or is it just kind of playing to type? Is there a more authentic way of being? Can we just take a breath and let it wash over you and realize in the end, it doesn't really mean that much?
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess that's
okay.
That comes through in the article and his praises of idleness. I think so much of our kind of striving and goal setting and trying to reach these ideals, I don't know, it isn't always what we need. And I think focusing on those times where you can be idle and just rest and just chill out. I think we live in a culture that frowns at that a lot of the time. So
I do want to note that I agree with you, but I want to note that what I said before was a false dichotomy.
Yeah.
Because, there can be walking with one's son out of anxiety or obligation or feeling you have to make up for the previous times when you were a bad father. And that's work.
Yeah.
That's not idleness anymore. And, conversely, you could write a philosophy paper because that's relaxing for you, because you've already done the striving work to become a master in your field.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think that there is something, it's not just the kind of activity, it's the attitude you bring with you to that activity.
Yeah, definitely. We read a philosopher in your ethics class. He wasn't a philosopher, but I forget the article that was making that point about sports and life in general. It's not so much you do, but the way that you do it. Like, I think he was...
It's not whether you win or lose, it's how you play the game.
he was critiquing John Stuart Mill's higher and lower pleasures. He was saying
right.
It's about how you interact with the pleasure, and that, yeah.
There can be a thuggish way to enjoy opera.
Yep.
And there can be a refined way to swill beer.
Yeah.
Okay. I buy that.
Like podcasting. Yeah. Well, what are you going to grade this one, Chris?
I'm going to give this one an A.
Okay.
I'm just going to give it an unambiguous A. I think that, this is a bold new direction. This goes beyond, like he has a separate paper that we're not going to discuss where he just focuses on critiquing or commenting on Brian O'Connor. He goes beyond just commenting on others' work. Like, the last paper we read, he was mostly embroidering or interpreting Nguyen and sort of tying it to his work. This is a decisive step in his own direction, in counter-distinction to Suits' position. So it adds to a discussion that's going on in the discipline. It's more boldly original, I think, than the ones we've considered so far. So for me, this stands out as the strongest of the three pieces.
Nice. Okay. Yeah. Right on. Well, with that, thank you guys very much. This was fun. See you next time.
See you next week. Let's do this again.
Always fun. See you next week.